Hello and welcome to the latest Science for Sport podcast. I'm your host Matt Solomon, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Andy Hyde. So Andy is the founder of Aesthetic Athletics, a company based in Manchester which works with both professional and youth level footballers to improve their physical performance. So who better today to discuss how you can improve your groin resilience than Andy? So without further ado, it's time to welcome him onto the show. Andy, welcome to the Science for Sport podcast. It's a pleasure to have you here.
It's a pleasure to be here for the third time, so thanks for having me.
Thank you very much for joining us. So can you give us a quick introduction as to who you are and what you've been up to until now?
Yes, I am a strength and conditioning coach from Manchester, and I did my degree and my master's at Leeds Beckett University in sport and exercise science, and then strength and conditioning. I did a short stint with Leeds United Ladies Academy whilst doing my master's degree, and then after that I did a year in the NHS in a hospital gym, which was a new role, so there was two S&C, two of us working there, and then after that I went full-time in Manchester with my own business, working with elite senior players and also youth players that are in academies, and I work with Science for Sport a little bit as well.
Absolutely excellent. So we're here today to discuss the groin, not your groin, to be clear, the groin generally. So can you give us a quick rundown of what the muscles are which make up that area?
Yeah, so when we refer to the groin, we're speaking more about a region of the inner thigh. So the main muscle that comes to mind will be the adductor, which inserts near the thigh, and it works to move the leg inwards and stabilize the hip. Now there's a few different muscles there. So you've got the adductor longus, you've got the adductor brevis, and then the magnus. So that's three different muscles, and they will work in movements such as like a lateral shuffle, a lateral cut, or a crossover step, if we're trying to visualize what actions they will be involved in on the football pitch. They also work to decelerate the leg in forward or lateral movement. And the adductor longus tendon connects near the pubis bone as well, which we'll touch on when we get into the injuries.
Cool. So why are they important? Like, you've just gone through some different movements, but why is that important then for football, but team-based sport generally?
So basically, if the adductor longus isn't strong enough, the tendon will experience more of the load in these different actions, such as a lateral cut or a lateral shuffle or a deceleration. When there's a sharp increase in load, or this load is sustained for too long of a period that doesn't allow sufficient recovery, pain and inflammation can occur, which can usually result in like an adductor tendinopathy. Going back to the pubic bone, adductor tendinopathy, and that's what we're probably going to focus on today rather than strains, is because I see a lot more of that in players, with the players that I work with. Touch wood, we've never had any strain issues in the groin, but between the one-to-one and online clients, I've had 4 or 5 adductor tendinopathy issues that I've worked with in the past. So it's closely related to osteopubis, and that's another injury, and both of these can be experienced at the same time. Basically, both injuries could potentially coexist. This is slightly different. It's an inflammation of the pubis symphysis, which is kind of a bony area where each side of the pelvis meets, and it can cause pain in more of like the lower ab, pelvic and hip flexor region, rather than the inner thigh and groin area. So these two can be treated slightly differently based on the regions, but a lot of the programming might look pretty similar, and again, they can sometimes coexist.
Cool. So you've got like the tendinopathy injuries, and you've got like a strain injury. What are the difference between those two different things?
So the tendinopathy is more to do with the amount of load from playing and training, basically, which results in the pain and the inflammation, whereas the strain, usually it can be caused by load still, but there's usually a moment or potentially an action on the pitch, which could be something like lunging in for like a slide tackle, or a goalkeeper really opening up the leg to drop and save a shot. And sometimes that rapid lengthening and eccentric stretch under either high force or high speed of that region, if it exceeds what the muscle is capable of, then you can get a strain, which obviously is slightly different to the tendinopathy itself.
Yeah. So when it comes to the game demands itself, right? Like you just mentioned a couple of situations where like an injury might occur, but what are the game demands on the groin? Because obviously you've got loads of different actions. You're going to be all over the pitch with the high-speed sprinting, changes of direction, all that kind of stuff. So what happens in the game which forces the groin to have any kind of load demand?
Okay, so the first thing to make clear is that eccentric actions produce a higher muscular tension than a concentric action. So that's what we're going to focus on. And there's this paper is central for me with this kind of stuff. I think it's by Harper, and I can't remember his first name, but I think the co-author is John Keeley. I think it was a paper from 2018 on, and they're basically making like a short kind of statement based off other research that they've collated in this paper. But what they found is, and I've had to write this down to remember it because I wanted to quote it correctly, but let me get it up. The load per meter is around 37% more in decelerating versus accelerating, and high intensity decelerations are up to 2.9 times more frequent than accelerations in football specifically. So first of all, this is presenting to us a situation where in football, decelerations are not only really intense, but they're really frequent, and they don't have to occur with a high-speed run. So let's say you've got a attacker in the centre of the pitch, let's say a centre midfielder, and they're twisted and turning, dropping the shoulder. They even turn away from you to shield the ball, but they're dropping in and out, kind of like a Messi would. You don't have to be at a high speed run. You can just be behind them, and you're trying to jockey and stay with them. But they know what they're doing. Like they're still having to make some pretty hard and harsh movements, but they're controlling the ball. Whereas you're responding to them, it's unplanned for you, and you don't have the ball at your feet. So you could be, without having to be at any kind of high speed, you're really hitting the ground hard, potentially outside your centre of mass, dropping into hip flexion and decelerating, turning, and this really, really lengthens and kind of challenges the adductors to do their job under high load and high speed. And if it's really intense and it's happening really frequently, you can quickly see, especially for defenders, in my opinion, because they do so much movement off the ball, especially side to side to stay with play or to stay with an attacker or to cover ground laterally really quick to block a shot. It presents an issue for them where they need to be able to handle this load. In my opinion, if there's 2 game weeks, we don't, and the paper actually says this itself, be careful with dosing deceleration work. If there's 2 game weeks, I don't think we need to top up any decelerative load on the field. You've even got to consider that in a 1 game week. One, if players are needing to recover from the back end of a 2 game week, but also if small-sided games are being used in training, do we then need to top up more field-based decelerative load, especially when you potentially want to be targeting things such as top speed exposure every week? For me personally, I don't think so. If you're going to do it, like, you best do it with caution. I think if you are going to do it as well, I think it has to be for a really good reason. So if you identify an issue in a player's decelerated movement or change of direction movement, whether it's their technical ability to decelerate with how they drop the hips, the position of the foot or the footsteps, in the change of direction, if it's where their foot strikes or which foot strikes the floor first in relation to the center of mass or their trunk position, then maybe if these players are experiencing issues in terms of the groin and the adductor area, or potentially even with that osteopubis, pubis, then maybe they need to go on the field and do some specific work to solve these problems that are individual. But if that isn't happening, then I strongly question whether you need to be on the field doing specific decelerative work every week, especially when the data is showing that, players don't get up to necessarily high running speeds and then decelerate. And most of the drills that we see online or in practice are like a straight line run to a split or set deceleration or a side on one. And coaches are progressing the distance. But the research is suggesting that maybe this is not what the players do. So therefore, it maybe isn't what they need.
And I'm rudely interrupting to make sure you're up to date and aware of the Science of Sport Coach Academy. The Coach Academy is an overgrowing library of sports science courses which are broken down into bite-sized chunks. So if you're enjoying today's podcast and you want to get your hands on some more great sports science information, all you have to do is hit the link in the show notes and you can get in there completely for free for the next 7 days. So hit that link in just a few minutes' time. Absolutely excellent. So when it comes to like testing some of this stuff, what kind of testing can be done to make sure that there's a decreased risk of injury or that the athletes are prepared for the game demands?
So I think the first one, which anyone can do, and it's really, really simple, and it's going to be painfully obvious. And some coaches, because of how obvious and kind of commonly they're used, some coaches on social media will bash them a little bit, but a Copenhagen hold. So we'll get onto how I use them a little bit later, but can a player hold a Copenhagen with good hip and trunk stability and pelvic stability with, minimal or no pain for 30 seconds each leg? I think that's just a starting point. Usually if you have a player that has some sort of issues or weakness, they won't be able to do that, and it tells you we need to work on something here. The other one is a standing lateral lunge, with a slider, so sliding out. How, without relying too much on cheating by flexing and using the trunk on the standing leg, but with the leg that slides out, how well can they lengthen the groin and how far can they get without kind of pain or issues, and can they bring it back in? But I think if you're looking for more objective data, the best test is going to be an iso adductor squeeze test, where you'll have players lay on the back, you'll put something like a ball in between the legs that they can squeeze on, and each foot will be underneath a force plate, and they're going to squeeze the ball as hard as they can whilst applying force through the force plate. And if you've got dual force plates, they'll be able to detect how much force is being applied through each foot. And metrics wise, for a test like that, you're probably going to look at like peak force or rate of force development. You might even look at rate of force development in 100 milliseconds, so that really early moment where they start to squeeze. How quick can they apply the force? And if you've got certain force plates, like the ones I have, will give you instantly the percentage difference between limbs for each metric. And sometimes they even give, depending on the metrics and the test, they will give you a percentile of where that player is at versus other people of similar age and gender that have done that test, and the data's on the database. But if you're not given that information straight away, then you just use a limb symmetry index, where you take potentially the affected limb divided by the unaffected times by 100, and then you get a percentage difference. And generally speaking, it changes per metric and per test that you do, but you usually want differences that are definitely under 10%, more towards 5%, if not a little bit less, between sides.
Absolutely excellent. So obviously that can then lead into some programming as well. So when you're going to program for either like a strong groin or rehab or whatever it might be, what kind of training are we looking at? What are kind of exercises, sets and reps? Take us through the whole process.
So if we start with maybe a rehab perspective, I think the first thing to do in the case of either tendinopathy or a strain is to reduce decelerative load you know, in the case of a strain, it might be completely removed because with the tendinopathy, it's probably the load that's caused this in the first place. And then I think the second is to bang on the pads in the right place with exercise selection. So for me, what I found from working with the 4 or 5 players that I've worked with so far, where we've had successful rehabs, and some of them still working with and are going through the processes still, because some of these issues can really, if they get quite bad or they've come to me and they've had them for years, the longer it's been around, the longer it takes to get rid of, is mid to long duration isometrics with light loads initially for that kind of tender love and care to basically help manage and reduce the pain in the tendon and the inflammation. And we usually use light loads because we'll use exercises such as long lever ball squeezes. So where you sat on the floor, you have a ball between your feet and you squeeze and hold. You can start off with softer squeezes, pain dependent, and earlier in the rehab process for longer durations of up to like 30 seconds. And then as it gets more intense, you can work down to like 20, 15, and then you're getting on to 8 to 10, where you're like kind of, you know, some coaches argue, is it yielding or overcoming, whatever, working more on the max strength of the tendon. Another one that's been received really well is leaning split squat holds. So we get players into a rear foot elevated split squat position, or Bulgarian, whatever you want to call it. We take a little bit of a wider stance, and then they take the shin and the torso forward, and we don't use much load because it tends to then hit the quads more. But we lean forward into it, lengthen the groin, and put it into maybe a similar position with a lot of hip flexion in like what you'd see in a deceleration, and they hold it for like a minute each side. And early on, or just for that kind of, again, that TLC to get rid of the pain and the inflammation, these seem to really work well. And then we'll also introduce lateral lunge sliders, and we'll just start off eccentrically. Usually, if you have identified a weakness, they'll struggle to lift back in, or they'll struggle with confidence too, or maybe the pain level will be above that around 4 out of 10 that really you don't want it to be above whilst you're managing the load. The other thing we do is we get into deep squats. They're really underrated because of how well they lengthen the adductors. So we do that to get a loaded stretch, and again, as long as the pain is managed well, I think because they're so general, people forget them for the different individual reasons they can be good. And we don't just do that with like deep loaded squats as a strength exercise. I'm looking at my rack there, I don't know why, because no one else can see it. But we use it in a plyometric sense as well. So Matt Watson's been on the podcast before. He's your plyo guy. But his low and deep plyometrics, where you're going into deeper ranges in a low or deep. So low is basically where you stay low. Imagine you've got like a low ceiling above your head and you don't rise out of it. That keeps the overall impacts lower. But deep means you still go into that low position, but you actually have the intent to push out and go high and then land deep again. So you can do this with squat and split squat positions, and you can manipulate the direction. So you're moving forwards, backwards, inwards, then outwards, and then you can go side to side. So you're redirecting yourself. And I use these season round, not just for players with issues, to get them into these deep and low positions, so they can relax at the knees and the hips, so they can lengthen the groin and get some load in that region with higher forces, higher ground impacts, and higher speeds than what we would just get from a strength exercise. And then again, we look at, was it just a load mismanagement issue, or were there specific issues? So if potentially you have done a video analysis of a player's lateral shuffle or change of direction, was there issues? And again, this is where the coach's eye comes into it. Is there an issue with the trunk stiffness? Stability around the pelvis and the adductor area? Or did you just identify in the false place that it was probably maybe an adductor strength or load issue? Do they hit the ground with the outside foot before the inside foot? And is that right for that context, or is that wrong? Or is there a better way to do it? Is it better to hit with the inside foot? Do they get the right the right position with the foot outside of the body to be able to reorientate themselves. So there's obviously different things there that you can look at, but you can go down a rabbit hole with that stuff, because then you're like, how much trunk stiffness. You want them to be able to create some stiffness, but you don't want a rigid player. You want a player that can be adaptable and still deal with some degrees of movement and flexion at the trunk and stuff like that. So that's a whole different topic, but kind of jumping off the back of that from there, another thing that I've used in the past is like an aqua bag. So if there is issues with trunk stiffness or stability or around the pelvis or hip region, we might use an aqua bag where we're holding it closer to the body, and as the player moves, they move it away from the body aggressively, and we might do that with something like a drop step into like a really long length forward lunge, where again they're going into hip flexion and they're lengthening the groin area, and they've got to be confident with hitting the ground hard and taking that impact. You could change it up a little bit and do it laterally. You could do it laterally with a really quick shift off a plate. So again, you're considering the different lengths and positions that the groin might get into on the pitch. And then that's more rehab. So we could go now, I know I've been blabbing for a while, but now we could go into basically general training. So active recovery, I really like sumo squat holds with no load, because again, that usually just shifts it more to the quads. But you get a player to put the feet really wide, like over double a squat width, and you get them to sit right into the hips, so that they're not going anywhere near past 90 with the knees. And usually like match day +1, if you do like 3 sets of something like this for 60 seconds, it just loosens off that area, gets some blood flow, promotes the recovery process. They feel a little bit less stiff. Usually I don't put all my eggs in this basket, because you want to just manage load well and make sure they're strong enough and stuff. But if players ever come out, or they come into a session and they say, not feeling too good here, we'll just do something like that, because it can also be done in like, less than 5 minutes. Copenhagen's, I keep in the warm-ups year round. So if they have 3 or 4 sessions a week, whether it's uppers or lowers, they'll do 1 set of Copenhagen's, whether it's a hold or a lift, and then that way throughout the week with microdose and accumulated somewhere from like 3 to 4 sets, without it having to take up precious time in the program when we're working on more specific things. If we're specifically working on that and that's a priority, then it might be in the actual program itself. And again, with these, you can start with holds. You can go, I think Alex Natira did some interesting research like in-house on the contribution or the demand on the adductors with knee bend and straight leg positions. So it'd be that would be something worth checking out. But again, with Copenhagen's, you can manipulate them in terms of, do you do it on an unstable surface to challenge stability? Do you add in something like, do you add in a dynamic movement like a knee drive? Or I think the most important one for me is, do you increase the range? So do you go to higher boxes or higher platforms, and players have to drop the hips lower and really lengthen in bigger ranges, basically. And then apart from that, in terms of plyometrics, again, going back to some of Matt's work, I look at a lot of medial movements, so crossover bounds where the foot's moving to the inline, the midline of the body, and you're hitting the ground with impact. And then apart from that, if you're looking at the pubis area, again, you might look towards the hip flexors, the lower abs and trunk, and more integrated core work, like, upper body work where you're having to use the core, like a side plank with a row. You might also have to consider with the hip flexion, looking at sprinting as well and the load and capabilities there. But yeah, that's pretty much it, to be honest.
And I'm interested to hear, because you've just lifted off like a great load of exercise and how to use them. Like, if you were to put that into, let's say, 1 or 2 sessions a week, how would that look in terms of like just getting that into a player's, let's say, Monday and Thursday? Like, what would you do in terms of actually programming that stuff?
Good question. So usually, if it's a Monday and they've had a game on a Saturday, or even if you're a coach working in a pro club, it could be a Sunday. You're going to use more of those TLC exercises and the isometrics. And I think you're also okay to use the low jumps, not the deep jumps because of the higher ground impacts, but the low jumps I found are really, really effective for getting players to microdose a little bit of low intensity plyometric work where they're yielding and there's more. And by yielding, I mean they're able to relax and gain something from the eccentric part of the jump when they relax, and they can just bounce back out of it, basically. But usually earlier in the week we're using more of that stuff, and then when it gets to a Thursday, as long as they're feeling good, if they've had a 2-game week, which most of the time if the load is managed well they are, or if it's a 1-game week, usually we know we're okay at match day -2 to do more of the Copenhagen-based exercises in the warm-up, the stuff like the aquabag work, and then the more intense plyometrics like the crossover bounds or lateral bounds, or like a lateral drop to push where you're trying to drop, hit the ground hard, and then displace your body laterally with as much distance as possible, basically. So yeah, that's kind of how it will run. I think what you've got to remember is that the plyometrics, if these are issues that they're dealing with, most of the plyometrics might be geared towards fixing this issue. But what you've also got to remember is they're still working on creating a more reactive, a more explosive, and a more dynamic athlete. Even though, I mean, I know that a lateral band isn't going to produce as much, for argument's sake, let's call it power, as like, a double kata movement jump in the air, or like, some high intensity hopping, let's say, in a straight line. But you've got to consider what the priorities in the program. Like, if a player's got a groin issue and that's a priority, we need to work on that to get them match available, then I might change intense hopping to lighter hopping where they're moving inwards, and we're just changing the stimulus slightly to target that inner leg position. Or if they were doing speed bounds to work on something that we wanted to work on to improve the speed, if they can't get on the pitch and sprint because they've got an adductor issue, well then we might need to change these to like deep lateral bounds or the crossover bounds if we've not got space to put things in anywhere else. And I think sometimes you've just got to have that ability to step back, look at the program and be like, what do I need here to get this player like healthy and match fit first? And then once we get to that point, what do I need to keep in to keep them healthy? And then how much room do I then have to look more at them exceeding and prospering as an athlete rather than just being match available and healthy, basically. Which I think is just a skill that comes over time, and when you truly understand why you have a particular exercise in the program and does it need to be there right now.
Absolutely excellent. So Andy, massive thanks for your time and efforts today. It's been a pleasure talking. Where can people find a little bit more about you and what you're up to?
Most of what I share is on Instagram, just aesthetic athletes. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, buddy. It's been a pleasure talking, and I look forward to speaking again soon.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Cheers, buddy. And that's it. Once again, a massive thanks to Andy for all of his hard work on today's podcast. I really appreciate it, and I'm sure you do at home too. Before you leave, I want to point you in the direction of the Science of Sport Coach Academy. And the Coach Academy is an overgrowing library of sports science courses which are broken down into bite-sized chunks. So if you enjoyed today's podcast and you want to get your hands on some more great sports science information, all you have to do is hit the link and you can get in there completely for free for the next 7 days. So hit that link in just a few minutes' time. And of course, if you have enjoyed today's podcast, it'd be fantastic if you could recommend it to a coach, a colleague, an athlete, or a friend. That means that we can keep bringing you the best possible guests and the best possible content. And that's it. Once again, a massive thanks from me. I'm Matt Solomon of Science of Sport, and I'll speak to you next week.